Thank you so much to all of you coming out and the folks at the Coolidge. This is like my dream, like the idea of having a repertoire series that I get to participate in, not just for Herzog, which was amazing, but just any opportunity to cross what I really think is this false divide between the humanities and science. It seems silly to me to separate the two of them. And, obviously I'm a shrink talking, so my surgery friends might say, hey, he's a shrink, he gets to say that stuff. But I actually really believe that the best way into the sciences is through the humanities and vice versa. I think it's a false distinction. So as we start to kind of tease one or the other of these disciplines out of our secondary schools or our colleges, it worries me. So part of my preaching is here in talking about this movie is stems from my real desire that we keep both of these topics alive. This was a hard one, I got to say. So I've talked, I was thinking about the places I've done Science on the Screen before. I did one on Night of the Living Dead, which was really fun. And that was where I did get to talk about zombie brains and wrote a zombie novel as a result of that. And I owe that to the folks at the Coolidge for making that possible. That's how I got to know Romero, which was really, really special to me. I did one on the Evil Dead, second one, Evil Dead 2. Which is a lot like Evil Dead. It's the same darn movie, just had a bigger budget, so we made it again. I did one on Rushmore, talking about adolescent brain development. I did one on A Face in the Crowd, which may or may not have had something to do with the most recent election. That's the one with Andy Griffith. And we talked about the neurobiology of charisma. All of those in some ways lent themselves to science. This one's harder. Okay, this one, if we want to move away from just talking about why people do extreme things, as the protagonist in this film does, and instead talk about generally why a movie like this moves us as it does. And it's a very moving film. How many folks have seen it before? Just curious. Yeah, so at least half the folks here. It's on the big screen especially, it's a very provocative film in a way that kind of transcends language. Much like the feeling we get when we hear poetry, and that's why I have this highbrowish Harvard-y title up there, which, by the way, my Kansas father snubbed me for, which I'll get over. I'm still, he's 80. Eventually I'll impress him, but we're not there yet. So this one, instead of going from the science to the humanities, we're going to start in the humanities and ooze our way to the sciences. And we're going to do that by looking at this movie as if it's a poem and then talk about what our brains look like when we are experiencing the sublime experience of poetry. And I'm going to try and make that relate to the movie itself, and we'll do all that in about 25 minutes. Now, before we get started, there is a gargantuan caveat. I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Herzog back in early February when he was here. I also had the pleasure of resisting as best I could the desire to speak with a German accent, which is what always happens when I speak. It's like trying to not talk like Yoda when you watch Yoda. It's the same phenomena. He was amazing. And then I started doing research about him, more than I knew just, as a sort of film enthusiast. And I found this interview he did with GQ back in 2011, where he did not seem very fond of what I ostensibly do for a living. This is the busiest slide I'm going to show you. I am going to read it out loud. I will not read it with a German accent, but you'll see why I bring some caution to this event. I think psychology and self-reflection is one of the major catastrophes of the 20th century. A major, major mistake. And it's only one of the mistakes of the 20th century, which makes me think that the 20th century in its entirety was a mistake. And then he equates this to the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition had one goal: to eradicate all traces of Muslim faith on the soil of Spain, and hence you had to confess and proclaim the innermost, deepest nature of your faith to the commission. And almost as a parallel event, explaining and scrutinizing the human soul into all its niches and crooks and abysses and dark corners is not doing good to humans. We have to have our dark corners and the unexplained. We will become uninhabitable in a way an apartment becomes uninhabitable if you illuminate every single dark corner and under the table and wherever. You cannot live in a house like this anymore, and you cannot live with a person anymore, let's say in a marriage or a deep friendship, if everything is illuminated or explained or put on the table. There is something profoundly wrong. It's a mistake. Try telling this to my mom. That's cool. It's a fundamentally wrong approach towards human beings. So he said this about what I do. I mean, I'm a psychiatrist. That's what I did. But I was thinking, okay, I'm going to get before I went to medical school, I was a high school English teacher. And I started looking at this sentence, and I thought, you know what? I'm a little bit more comfortable with this because his grammar is not correct. So, and I think we could draw something from that. Herzog uses the singular verb is following a compound subject, psychology and self-reflection. It should be are, unless in his mind, and granted, it's his second language. I can't do this in German what he did in English. But unless in his mind they're the same thing, and I don't think they are. So if he's making the case that psychology and self-reflection are one and the same, then he gets to use that singular verb. But that's actually a place where I disagree with him. I think if we confuse psychology, the study, or psychiatry, the study of what makes us behave in the way we do, what we leave out are those dark corners that he's talking about, those ambiguities that make us uniquely personal. And that's what we see in this movie, and that's what we see in each other. That's what we see in our partners. That's actually what makes the people that we decide to spend our lives with interesting. It's not the things you know, it's the things that you find out or maybe never even quite understand. To me, that's where the poetry comes in. So I think that we can study the self, but that's not the same thing as understanding every self that we study. And that, to me, reminds me an awful lot of the study of poetry. So that's my sort of roundabout way of getting us to poems. If you think about it, we can all diagnose a poem, right? You can look at a sonnet, and if it's ABBA, ABBA, BCE, BCE, you can say that's a Petrarchan sonnet. That's the diagnosis. It meets the objective criteria for a Petrarchan sonnet. But that's not the same thing as saying, what is the meaning of that sonnet? Because that's unique and personal. That's the dark corner that I think Herzog's talking about. That sonnet will mean something different to each of us, even at different points of our life, because we'll have had different experiences. So that's my way of saying, you know what? I think I can approach this as a poem and therefore satisfy Herzog's fear in some way, like not kowtow to his fear that psychology has ruined our individuality. I don't think it has. We just can't mistake it for saying that it tells us who we each uniquely are. If you want to put it in the guise of what I do for a living, really do, which is to diagnose psychiatric illness, one person with bipolar disorder is one person with bipolar disorder. That's not like every person with bipolar disorder. Every person is uniquely special, which I know sounds like something Mr. Rogers would say, but it's also really, really, really true. So, my approach to this talk is to approach Timothy in Grizzly Man as if he's a poem. And it really is a poetic movie when you see it. It leaves you with a feeling before it leaves you with an understanding, which is what the neurobiology of poetry shows us. And there is a neurobiology of that, which I'm going to introduce you to in a second. But before we get there, I have to do a caveat. I'm required to do a caveat, actually, by my professional society. This is a caveat that we have been talking about a lot lately in the press in psychiatry. Does the Goldwater Rule apply here? So the Goldwater Rule, as you guys may know if you've been listening, watching the news lately, when Barry Goldwater ran for president, before I was born, there were a number of psychiatrists and psychologists, mental health clinicians, who said, this guy's not fit to run. And then the American Psychiatric Association, in response to that, said, you know what? It's not really ethical to say that he's not fit to run, because if you've examined him enough to know that he's not fit to run, then you're violating his confidentiality by commenting. And if you haven't examined him, then you have no right saying whether you think he's fit to run. We can argue about whether this is an appropriate or inappropriate stance for mental health clinicians in the current circumstances. I'm not going to go there. But it does make me think, am I violating that professional standard that still stands for the American Psychiatric Association by diagnosing or at least thinking out loud about what motivates Timothy, the protagonist of Grizzly Man? I don't think I am, and here's why. It's not just any Timothy that we're talking about. It's not even the Timothy in real life that we're talking about. We're talking about Herzog's interpretation of Timothy. That's the really cool thing about this movie. Herzog didn't film this, as you guys may know. He had 100+ hours of film, and he took out 2 hours of film. He created a story. And he's even said that his documentary films are really feature films disguised as documentaries. So this becomes very meta after a while, right? This is my interpretation of Herzog's interpretation of Timothy. That's a lot like the way many of us learned poems in the first place. I learned John Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, something we'll come to a little bit later, not by reading it for the first time, but by hearing it from Mrs. O'Leary, my English teacher, when I was in 11th grade English. So it was my interpretation of her interpretation of Keats. So in that sense, I think I'm not violating the Goldwater Rule, and we can proceed with a neurobiologic exploration of what our brains are like on poems. And by doing that, we can say this is what our brains are like when we watch this amazing movie you're about to see. So what are our brains like? When we hear poems, there's a lot of studies that have actually looked at this. They all come from the cognitive neuroscience literature. There's a couple of findings that show up over and over again. These are, what they do is they put folks in a functional MRI scanner and you look at where the brain uses up oxygen, or you might tag water. You're looking for increased metabolism in the brain and saying this region neuroanatomically of the brain is associated with this particular function. If it's that much more active when you hear poetry, for example, we think that's what poetry does to the brain. There's a little bit of specious logic there. We just know that one correlates with the other, but you can draw conclusions from it. So the first finding is that the nucleus accumbens, which is the region of the brain that receives these dopaminergic projections from the ventral tegmental area, the reward projections, the same projections that get stimulated when if you smoke a cigarette, when you make love, when you use cocaine, when you watch a TV show that you really like, those same exact feelings get stimulated. So there is a strong and powerful reward that's triggered upon hearing poetry. And what's interesting about the literature on poetry, which differentiates it from the literature on music, because the same findings have been found with music. When you have people listen to music that they find very, very moving in the functional MRI scanner, you see the nucleus accumbens light up. What you find is that poetry that inspires a negative affect, negative emotional response, you're almost repulsed by it, has an equally powerful response from the nucleus accumbens, which is really interesting. And explains why explains my favorite genre of movie is horror films, and explains in some ways why we like these kinds of experiences, or why certain poems that we might find very distasteful also persist and maybe even last longer. The other finding is that experimenter chosen poetry, that means poems that the people in the scanners haven't heard before. So not poems that they know, because then you would trigger different regions of the brain because they'd remember it. Experimenter chosen poems actually activate the regions of the brain that are associated with introspection first. That's the prefrontal area as opposed to the frontal area. And from there, it also activates more right brain than left brain for 97% of the population, since most of us are left brain dominant. That means we have language on the left side. So the right part of the brain, especially the right parietal lobe, is associated with our love of patterns. It doesn't have anything to do with language. It has to do with patterns and shapes and art. And there's a lot of studies that say whether right brain dominance, and it's a little bit of pop culture psychology, but it also holds up pretty well in the neuroscientific literature, both with EEG studies and with MRIs. We know that when people hear poetry, the right hemisphere gets excited more, and the introspection areas, the prefrontal areas, get excited more. And that's different from when you watch a narrative, especially a cohesive narrative, one that goes from A to B to C. And we're not talking Faulkner or Joyce, right? That would be different. That would be more in the poetry category. We're talking Dickens, something where there's a very clear narrative structure. If your brain is on narrative, it actually recruits the motor regions and the sensory regions more profoundly. So you hear a story and you recruit in a kind of mirror neuron way the activities of the protagonist in that story. Or if you're watching a movie, you recruit what you're seeing on the screen, and then you create a visual picture of what you're being told or what you're watching, and you continually update that picture going forward to match how the story has changed. It's a much more linear process, and it engages the frontal lobe as opposed to the prefrontal region. If you want to see what that looks like on a neuroimaging studies, narrative studies show that you've got the nucleus accumbens, which is that sort of round-shaped structure right smack in the middle there, and it's got this major dopaminergic highway that strings from the ventral tegmental area and then goes forward into the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe especially gets very excited when you hear a story. It gets excited because it's gotten the reward from the nucleus accumbens, and then it tries to make sense of what's going on using all those executive functions that exist in the frontal lobe. That's a very different experience from poetry and music. In poetry, now we've turned the brain, so you have to imagine you're looking at the top of that brain. You see, that's not the frontal lobe that's lit up there. That's just behind the frontal, that's the prefrontal area, the introspective area. You see the ventral tegmental and the nucleus accumbens as that region sort of near the back part here, and then you see the right parietal lobe up there. It's a very different neurobiologic signature when you hear poetry or when you hear music. And this has been looked at not just in terms of the way you feel emotionally, but way you literally feel physically. We can ask this question, how does that back and forth between the prefrontal brain and the nucleus accumbens feel? Well, we want to change that out of neuroanatomic speak and just put it in regular speech. What do we experience when we have our reward centers triggered by introspection and by the introspection being triggered by our reward centers? What do we experience physically? And you've all felt this. You've all felt this. It feels like that dog is feeling right now. It's a really, really good feeling. There's actually whole bodies of neurobiologic literature about the sense of chills running up your back in a good way. But what's fascinating, remember I told you that poetry can have negative affect and also trigger that reward? Those chills can be associated with negative affect as well, like that cat, where you get literally piloerection, the hair standing up straight. And the evolutionary biologists have a field day with this because they say, the cat does this because it's trying to look larger to scare folks away, and we've held on to that evolutionary response. Whereas the good feeling here is this sort of desire to hear the sublime, things that transcend language itself. Like people talk about poems. It's what a psychiatrist and philosopher, Lacan, who's actually really irritating to read, but if you ever get a chance to read Lacan, he says certain notions transcend language. We can't get to them. They become sublime, which literally translates to up to the threshold. Like you can't get over the threshold with the words themselves. This, to me, has a lot of meaning because it's tied to my love of horror. If you look at horror films and why people like horror films, the way these studies go is people come out and you'll say, hey, did you like that film? Say after watching The Exorcist. Some people say, hell no, no pun intended. And you say, okay, you get to leave. Did you like it? And some people say, absolutely. And then you find out, did they like it? Why did they like it? And you'll see that there's a noradrenergic response. They are frightened by it, or at least they have a fight or flight response. But there's also a metacognitive effort to understand why they're frightened. There's an introspection that goes on. Why did that scene particularly frighten me? Why was I, Steve Schlozman, nice bar mitzvah boy, scared of The Exorcist with the Satan and a priest? There is no fear of that in my religion, right? And yet, nevertheless, I was afraid of it. So there are these metacognitive exercises that transcend language. All I could say was, I don't know, it just looks scary. I can't get it into words. That exercise is very similar to what we see in poems, and it's also very similar to what I experienced when I watched Herzog's films. And as I said, I was lucky enough to talk to him about this. That's him when he was at the Coolidge, and here I am going to do his accent because it was just too much fun. We were chatting about his movie, and I said, you know, I like horror films. It really strikes me as a kind of horror film, Grizzly Man. There's this pattern that you see emerging, and horror films are all about pattern recognition, when the pattern stops matching what you think it ought to match, and then you get frightened for the protagonist because you see it before the protagonist does. And you're saying, like, you know, don't split up, don't go down that dark tunnel, like don't just fill in the blank. You can see it, but the protagonist doesn't. And I'm not going to spoil this film for the half of you who haven't seen it, but you'll have this experience as you're watching this movie. You'll see that this probably might not end well for Timothy, okay? And it's sad. I mean, it's funny because you're like, what does it take? And yet it's a very, very sad moment. So I said this to him, this is a lot like a horror film. And he smiled and he said, ah, yes, but it is terrible and it is true, and so it is beautiful most of all. That was his comment. And I got so excited by that, because that to me sounds like Keats. I mentioned Keats at the beginning, his famous Grecian urn poem. So I said, you're like quoting Keats. And he gave me this big smile, and I got all excited that we'd had this connection. And then I realized he was smiling at someone across the room. It had nothing to do with me, which is a lot like this movie where you think you've made a connection, but you haven't. You haven't crossed over the way you want to cross over. And so, what do Herzog and John Keats have in common? They're basically saying the same thing. Herzog is saying, it's terrible and it's true, and so it's beautiful most of all. These bears fighting in Grizzly Man, that's a barbaric scene. That's a scene that if humans were doing it, we would put a stop to it. But he's saying, this is just what they do. It's just the truth of what they do, and that's what makes it beautiful. And if you watch his movie, it's visually arresting. It's such a gorgeous movie, and it's very, very similar to that famous last line of Ode on a Grecian Urn that Keats said, beauty is truth, truth, beauty, that's all you need to know, all you know on earth, all you need to know. And I've always wondered, and this talk gave me the reason to sort of look for it, what urn was he talking about? What was he talking about? A specific urn? And it turns out, no, most of the scholars say he was actually talking about all of art. Any work of art that has this kind of sublime beauty that transcends language. A lot like poetry, a lot like trying to ask somebody, give me the scientific proof that the Sistine Chapel is beautiful. You can't. But for some reason, certain paintings last and other paintings don't. Certain poems last and other poems don't. Something happens and we have an experience, we have that feeling on the back of our neck that's well documented in the neurobiology, that's well documented when you watch this film, that actually makes these films stick around more than other films. There's a lot of films out there about people who cross this nature-human threshold, but Grizzly Man is something special. So let's move into talking about that. And to do that, we have to introduce this term biophilia, or biophilic, which is actually a term that Fromm, the philosopher, developed or coined, and then E.O. Wilson actually used it in his book Biophilia in 1984. He defined it as the urge to affiliate with other forms of life. And it is well documented that all of us get this kind of euphoric surge when we encounter a wild animal that we didn't think we would get to encounter. At its most boring level, it's when you stop on Harvard Street because there's weirdly a flock of turkeys, right? And you're like, that is just so cool. And everybody stopped and watching these turkeys. And then you can sort of take it up a level, right? You go whale watching and there's a whale. You go camping and there's a bear. But there are some folks who take it over that threshold. It becomes sublime because they go right up to the threshold and then overly sublime. They go over the top of it. Wilson said that nature holds the key to our aesthetic, intellectual, cognitive, and even spiritual satisfaction, which is a pretty profound comment when you think about it. Unless you think he was describing cute bunnies, he wasn't. Wilson was an expert in ants. He thought that that was beautiful. He thought that the symmetry of that, being able to connect with that, gave you meaning in life, right? So that's where we can approach Timothy. We can wonder, what do we know about Timothy's biophilic urges, this desire to connect with the grizzly bears, this desire to connect with this fox, which I found so compelling in the movie? There's actually not much research on this notion of biophilia. The one that I found most relevant to today's talk was from the Proceedings of Biological Sciences in 2013. It was a really interesting study. It was done in Germany. Basically, what they did is randomize students. There were 42 students, I think. Half of them were shown videos and shown corresponding sounds of highly urban environments, and half were shown videos and corresponding sounds of natural, beautiful, natural wonders outside, non-urban environments. And their hypothesis was that by being shown the natural, beautiful things, the urban sites weren't. It wasn't urban blight. It was just urban. That's the point here. Their hypothesis was that since most of human history we've lived in nature, not separate from nature, in the way we do now for this very, very small percentage of human history, future discounting would become less. That's a phrase that means, the way the experiments go for that is, I say to you, it's sort of like Wimpy from Popeye. If you give me $5, I'll gladly pay you tomorrow, whatever. It's, I'll give you $100 now, or if you wait 90 days, I'll give you $200. And people who discount the possibility that the future might arrive are much more likely to take the 100 on the spot. And it turned out in these studies, and in multiple studies that have replicated this, folks who experience just an hour of natural beauty on a video with the sound are much more likely to believe that there's a future worth looking forward to, as opposed to folks who are looking at the urban settings who are saying, no, I'll take the money right now. At least that was the conclusion drawn by the finding. And then the explanation offered, which is a bit of a preachy explanation, but a fascinating one, is cities are changing so rapidly and so quickly all of the time that it's hard for us to believe that there will be a tomorrow in an evolutionary sense. Whereas if you live out in the mountains, if you live as Timothy did, you get to slow things down and you start to recognize that there's a certain value towards waiting. You understand that there's a reward that comes downstream, which to me feels like a very relevant message for today, especially given the fact that even if you don't live in an urban setting right now, all of the wonderful ways that we connect with each other with our internet and smartphone, which I'm all for, I actually love that stuff, makes you feel like changes are constantly happening. It could be the same bit of news, but given to you with different words 57 times a day. And by that process, you start to think that every single day will change. So the biophilia people would say that's actually an anti-biophilic moment, and it makes us not really trust in tomorrow, makes us not make plans for tomorrow, not pull out of the Paris Accord, for example. Not that I would take a stand on that. I have a very personal experience with this. I've always worked with nature. That's actually a photo from the Outdoor Education Lab in Shawnee Mission, Kansas. That's where I grew up, in Shawnee Mission, Kansas, suburb of Kansas City, which I always told people looks exactly like Brookline, but with guns. That was the main difference. And it does. I mean, Dad was a doctor. So I worked at this nature lab, and we had all of these animals, and every time we got to hold these very exotic animals, I felt like I had crossed some kind of threshold. I got a lesson taught to me, though, that I wish in some ways, I don't know if I wish this, I think Herzog wishes that we would get this lesson in watching his movie when I met this guy. So that's a farmer had killed this badger's parents because they were eating his chickens, and then he brought to us, to this outdoor education lab, which was also a summer camp, the baby. And this baby imprinted on me. So this baby badger, I was the first thing it saw when it opened its eyes. It was right out of Conrad Lorenz. And I could walk zigzag through the prairie, and the badger would walk zigzag through the prairie. I could get down on my hands and knees and play. We would play like a dog. It was so awesome. I had connected with a wild animal, and we were one. That was the way it felt. Until it bit a kid. And it bit him really hard. It was a vicious bite. It wasn't a playful bite. That badger hit adolescence, and it didn't have the 2,000 or 5,000 years of domestication that our dogs enjoy. It had no evolutionary domestication. And we had to fight off lawsuits. We had to talk to the parents. Nothing really bad happened. We taped up the bite. The kid got a little traumatized. We let the badger go. We trained him to hunt. It turns out badgers love bees, so we would teach him to eat bees, which was really cool to watch. That was a biophilic moment for me where I recognized I had crossed that threshold a little too far. We should have trusted that badger, nor should my bosses with that kid. Now, can we combine that with the neurobiology of extreme experiences? Absolutely. That's actually a little bit more routine in the neuroscience world. We know that adolescents are much more likely to seek out thrills, in part because the pathways that connect to their frontal lobes, the region of the brain that tells them not to, are not well insulated. So they have lots of rewards for actually doing dumb things, and they have very little rewards for not doing dumb things. And the evolutionary biologists will explain that by saying that's the way they get permission to grow up and leave the house. Because they have to take these risks. They have to, and we hope they don't die. I have a daughter who's a senior in high school right now. We're so far so good, but it's a very scary thing to take care of kids because we know that that frontal part of their brain isn't as developed. The question is, do people who seek thrills, do those folks in the Olympics who do the ski jumping, do they do some way to take their frontal lobe offline, or do they actually engage their frontal lobe that much more in order to safely take the risk? And it turns out when you study those folks, the answers are all over the map. Some people take their frontal lobes offline. Some people actually massively engage their frontal lobes. The best example of this is the first lunar landing, where one of the astronauts' pulse went up to like the 120s, 130s. The other one stuck around at 60. They both were cool as a cucumber, but they had very different physiologic responses, which were directly related to brain function. So we have this metacognitive literature as well. Adolescents are intensely introspective. Might be why adolescents find their love of horror at that age. The average age that people first like horror films is age 11. And then the reward response regions of the brain in adolescents are much, much, much more defined than are the higher areas of the brain. We adults are much less likely to take the same risk. If somebody says, I dare you to drink 2,000 shots of tequila, you say, no, I'm going to go home and watch a rerun of Lost. Whereas kids might be much more likely to say, yeah, especially in a hotly affective environment, in an emotionally affective environment. Now, we know that this can then lead us on this spectrum from seeking out the novel, stopping to look at the turkeys on Harvard Avenue, to seeking out the sort of incredibly novel, stopping to say, see a fox when you see it run across the woods, maybe at, in one of the parks around here, to really taking it too far. And that's kind of Herzog's message, or at least one of the messages he suggests in this movie that we're about to see. If you want a great example of that in art, this happens all the time in art. So in the movie world, this, by the way, is just an excuse I have for working in one of my very favorite bad movies ever into a talk. So the first one is a fantastic movie. If you want a movie that shows you amazing novelty and also sends chills up your spine, you watch that scene over and over and over again. So that's John Boorman's Deliverance. That's the banjo scene. I cannot watch that scene enough. And every time I see that scene, I get chills up my spine. Now, Boorman, after he made that movie, it was an immense critical success. They said, do whatever you want, man. We're going to give you a gargantuan budget. It's 1974. Get whatever actor you want. Make whatever film you want. So he made novelty, but it gave us a different kind of feeling. He made this film. Anybody know what film that is? That's Zardoz. That's like my favorite how did it get made movie. Like, how did that ever get made? The suspenders and the Speedo, and how'd they get Sean Connery to do that? So in some ways, you can cross the threshold. And in many ways, if you read the critics, they say it was mostly Boorman's film to Boorman. It had nothing to do with an audience. He forgot about his audience. And fascinatingly, I think, although this could be a hypothesis, this is something that Herzog is suggesting about Timothy as well, even though he put himself on film. So just to summarize before we get to the film, watching extreme things, I think, is like experiencing a new poem. Whether you're watching the Olympics or whether you're watching Timothy in this movie, it transcends language. It becomes hard to actually describe. Neurobiologically, when we experience this extreme, we get introspective, and then we have a reward experience, a dopaminergic reward experience, and it's especially profound when we're exposed to wild experiences. That's the biophilic impetus that Wilson talks about. That exposure makes us more aware of the possibility of waiting, that there's a future that we can look forward to. That's actually the strength, I think, of this film. It's possible, though, that these rewards can cross these thresholds and get us into trouble. That's kind of the uncomfortable hypothesis that Herzog's offering, and that he actually offers in a lot of the movies that he makes. So if you have a chance to come watch Fitzcarraldo, a lot of that movie is about, do we take things too far in the end? So that's what I had for you guys today. Please email me with any questions, and this is a great film. I'm so glad you're here. Thanks.